Hello and welcome to Books Up Close, the podcast. I'm Chris Lloyd. This is the show for readers, writers, and anyone interested in how language works. In today's episode, I talked to Dan Sinykin and Johanna Winant about their book Close Reading for the 21st Century. Welcome, Johanna. Welcome, Dan.
Hi, so glad to be here.
It's delightful to be here.
Thanks so much for doing this. I saw your book a really long time ago on social media when it was first announced, and I was like, I need this in my teaching and my life. And it really doesn't disappoint, which is why I want to talk to you both. On this show, where I usually talk with a writer about their practice, we kind of analyze a passage together, and we do close reading, but this book really formalized what close reading was for me, even in my brain. I've been teaching that for a long time, but this helped my brain even figure out what I'm doing when I'm doing close reading, so I thought it'd be useful to talk to you both. But the first question I ask everyone on this show, just like a really simple one, is like, how do you feel about close reading as a practice? I'm assuming, you've written this book, so you must care about it, but like, what does it mean to you emotionally, intellectually, wherever you want to start, basically?
Oh, this is like our origin stories. I love close reading. I will say that I am an unabashed devotee of close reading. I mostly work on modern poetry, and in both my own writing and in my teaching, I'm often telling my students and telling myself to say something that I really believe about something very small. And that is where a lot of my ideas and inquiries and commitments begin. That said, like one of the things that I've thought about through the years of, graduate school and becoming a professor is both how to make close readings more useful to other people, which means framing them analytically and theoretically and conceptually, as well as how to make the practice more transparent to students.
For my part, my feelings about close reading have long been, I think, very complicated. I have a tendency to think analytically and abstractly. I was a math major as an undergraduate. The way my mind works, it was sort of like the purest. The purer the math, the more my brain leaned toward it. So abstract algebra, like an alternative path of my life could have been as an abstract algebraist. And I like when there's a nice, tidy, clean answer to things. And when I started grad school, I was known in my cohort for that stereotypically annoying position of theory guy, who was, kind of brought philosophy and was always talking about Kierkegaard or whatever. And I got a reputation, someone told me at one point, for being bad at close reading. And in my oral exams, halfway through grad school, my committee, their main thing they said to me at the end of the exams was like, look, you've got to slow down. You've got to slow down with the text and linger with specific language and let it be more complicated than you're letting the text be. You want to clean everything up. You want to make everything nice and neat and tidy. And so, writing this book with Johanna for me was part of a process of wrestling with something I've struggled with my entire life as a literary critic, something that I've needed to work at getting comfortable with, which is sitting in the mess and then trying to reckon with and do justice to the complexity of a literary object in words without oversimplifying it. And that is, one way to think about what close reading does at its best.
Yeah, absolutely. Like one thing I'm constantly telling my students is that there's nothing wrong to notice in a literary text. Even if I say something as specific as notice something weird or surprising, literary texts are so weird and surprising all the time. Like everything about them is weird and surprising.
Yeah, otherwise why would we go back to them, right? That's why we like the text, we hope. You say in the introduction, understanding close reading will make you a better reader, thinker, and writer about anything that you examine in detail and explain to someone else. And I wonder if you could explicate that a tiny bit more. Are you suggesting that, learning how to close read text allows you to close read the world? Is that your big jump?
This is something that Dan and I keep talking about, actually, that we have talked. I mean, first of all, I think you can see even from our answers about close reading why it's been such a delightful collaboration between us, that I think we both bring really like shared commitments and even intuitions, but also like really different kinds of backgrounds as well. And it's been very, mutually beneficial. At least that's how I feel. It's been very beneficial for me. And so, in terms of thinking about this question, this is something that like we continue to talk about because like one thing I think you see in the book is our commitment to conversation and collaboration. So, much of the book is co-written between the two of us. A lot of it is co-edited, that, the parts that we didn't write together, we edited together, bringing in other collaborators. And so, and we also really believe that even every close reading involves an invitation to conversation. So you're asking this question that's actually like one of our ongoing conversations about close reading, which is what does it mean to close read something? And we do believe that you don't just close read high art, for example, right? Like we're not just close reading Shakespeare sonnets, although there's a really wonderful analysis of a close reading of a Shakespeare sonnet in the book by Noreen Masood. But also that when you close read something, one of the things you are doing is treating it as if it were art, that you are treating it, you are making it into a text. And that's, certainly easier to do with some things than other things. But that close reading is a way not of like evaluating in some ways as much as simply valuing.
We held a symposium to launch this book at Emory University, and we brought a number of the contributors to talk, extend their thinking from the book at that symposium. And one of the most brilliant performances, each of these was a short 5 to 7 minute talk. And one of the most brilliant performances was by Christopher Spade, professor at the University of Southern Mississippi. And he did a close reading of the word okay as a text message. And all the ways he talks about this with his undergraduate students, because they understand how big of a difference it can be if that okay has an exclamation point at the end or not, if it has a period there or not. And he just kind of riffed on all the variations of the word okay in a text message and what the implications might be. So, it was a great demonstration of close reading something that's not a Shakespeare sonnet, but everyday use of a single word. I would also say something I've learned a lot from Johanna, something that I think really is at the core of the book that she brought to it, is the importance of argument and the idea that close reading has a transportable structure of inductive logic at the core of its epistemological work. And that form of inductive argumentation really does allow you to think well across objects.
Yeah, that's fascinating. The text thing is really funny because we do this in the first class. I do a first year class on close reading and just reading text generally, right? And I say, like, you do this every day when your friend sends you a WhatsApp message and you say, wait, why doesn't that have a capital letter? Why are they not using punctuation? Why is this emoji here? Why are they breaking it up into different individual messages, right? I'm like, this is an example of it. That's a really fun way to talk about that, about like the okay. I really wish I heard that now. That's so up my street.
The symposium was recorded as a podcast, a fellow podcast, American Vandal, and it'll be out in the new year. So people can listen in on the symposium.
Amazing. I will link to that in the show notes, as they say in this genre. The other thing I was going to say is shout out to Noreen Masood, who has been on this show before. We talked about a passage from her glorious, glorious book. So go back to that episode if you haven't listened to it already. She's wonderful and joyous in every possible way. And her chapter in this book is funny too. I'm like, she's doing close reading. She's arguing that actually I don't really understand the sonnet and I don't really understand the close reading of the sonnet, but it's great and it's funny. So yeah. And she talks about loaves of bread, like cat loaves. You have to read the book, basically.
Noreen was one of the first people we solicited to contribute to the book.
I don't blame you. So in the book, in the introduction, you kind of set up this framework for thinking about what close reading is, right? I think I've been doing it very loosely on this podcast, but you give a real kind of structure to what that looks like. And I wonder whether you could talk through those steps for people, not like at length, but just like give them a kind of sense of beginning with scene setting and ending with what you call global theorizing. And I wonder if you could just talk us through those steps briefly, just to give us a sense of it.
Sure. And just to be clear for your listeners, Chris, what Dan and I are talking about here is what we've called a close reading, the
Yeah.
noun, opposed to the verb close reading.
Mm.
So we're not talking about like what you're doing when you are looking at a text for the first time or even necessarily for the third or fifth time, but what you're doing when you are producing a close reading for your own reader,
Yeah.
or interlocutor. And we came up with these steps by reading a lot of close readings. Like we did not, this is not in some ways prescriptive, like this is a descriptive project
Mm.
where we were looking at a lot of close readings, and like it felt a little bit like, I don't know, maybe how Darwin felt when he went to the Galapagos to look at the finches' beaks or something. But like, what is it that holds this category together? Like, what is its internal logic? So that's just to say that, like, it's not that we are saying that all close readings have to be exactly this way. And we also think that close readings are more than the sum of their parts, but also there are parts. And this was an attempt to name and identify those parts.
So with that lead in, I'll say we identified 5 parts, or we call them 5 steps. When you begin to write a close reading, you want to invite your reader into the conversation. And to do that, you need to set the scene. We call this scene setting, where you're giving enough context, intellectual context, context of where we are going to be in the poem or story, so that your reader can follow you, join you, and notice the detail you're about to point out to them. That's the second step, noticing. And that's when you identify one tiny detail in the poem or play, text message, novel that you're going to base your argument on. And you're going to say, this was surprising or angering or frustrating or whatever, but I noticed it. And now we're going to build an argument from it. Your third step is local claiming. You build a claim, you make a claim about what that detail is doing or how it works right there in that moment in the poem or the novel, just in that line or that sentence or that paragraph. And then you begin to notice patterns that are in sympathy with that claim across the poem or across the novel. You make a regional argument. You say something about the entirety of that novel, the entirety of that poem. That's the fourth step. And finally, you can scale up to global theorizing. That's where you speculate or posit something on the basis of your argument for that text across an oeuvre or across a literary period or across a genre. And so what you've done by that point is you've moved from a tiny little detail to a vast terrain of literary history or literary form. And that's the power of close reading.
Yeah, those 5 steps, I think it was just very useful to like just chart them or map them onto the way I've been approaching text or the way my students would. And I think it's such like a helpful kind of scaffolding, if you like, of the kind of the various parts. But I wanted to ask you, like, are there parts that you find in your readings or that you notice in your students like the most difficult? Because I was reading the introduction and I was thinking often it's the claiming stage, I think, for my students, like I see a thing, but now, what are the stakes of that thing? I think is what you describe it, right? Like, what are the stakes of the argument? And I find that always quite hard to tease out or describe to students, to be like, it like, I've always want to say, well, it depends on the thing you're looking at and the kind of thing you're saying, but that's not very helpful, right, in the moment. But I wonder whether you have your own kind of sticking points or things you've noticed about those steps.
Yeah, I agree with you. I find that moment of moving from a detail to making a claim really difficult. And I think for me, part of what I've found difficult about that is that when we do it as professionals, often we're relying on a lot of knowledge about the genre of literary criticism, about the genres of theory that we might already have embedded within our minds. You're going to make a certain kind of claim about what a detail means differently if you're a Jamesonian than if you're a Derridian. And there's different kinds of rules or assumptions of inference that you're going to make with those. So the rules are varied, and we don't articulate them clearly that often as pedagogues or in our field. And trying to articulate exactly for students what those rules of inference, what those rules are for making a claim from a detail, that move from a detail to a claim, are really hard. I think Johanna has some really great ways for thinking about how students are like can do that without needing all this the infrastructure that you get trained into as a professional over the years. But I also suspect I've heard Johanna speak very brilliantly many times about the challenge of noticing itself and how that is a really, really hard thing to get students to learn how to do.
Yeah, I think my sense is often that noticing is really hard because it's a moment of vulnerability. So it's hard, not necessarily intellectually in a sort of pure intellectual way, but it's a real moment of like courage often that it requires. This is what I was writing about in that Boston Review essay in particular, that pointing to something on the page for a student that is not a right answer. They're not identifying a genre or using a word like dichotomy or talking about how they know the historical context or tracing a theme. There's no right answer to this. And instead, what they're doing is confessing puzzlement on some level. That's a really, really vulnerable moment. And it takes students, I think, often a while to trust me as their teacher when I ask them to do that. So I've found it to be useful to first of all be like very straightforward and honest about that. That there is no right answer, that this is something that they just have to trust themselves about as well as trust me, and that it really helps if it's something very small because that will restrict the sort of range of anxiety as well as the range of kinds of claims they can make, right? So they're not noticing a whole paragraph. I ask them to notice a single word or sometimes something that's missing or punctuation, and really sort of think about like, what does it mean that it's this word rather than another, or that the sentence ends here instead of continuing. Like, what are the Helen Bendler calls this the roads not taken, that a poem in a poem, that like, how else could this have been different and what would it have meant if it were? So then why does it matter that it's the way that it is? And so like just in terms of what Dan's saying, in terms of like picking up on what kinds of expertise students might already bring to this. Like I think often even like very new undergraduates bring a lot to the literary studies classroom that they don't necessarily even are not aware that they bring. So our book starts with a close reading of The Red Wheelbarrow by William Carlos Williams, a poem known as The Red Wheelbarrow. And we point to the word glazed in that poem and make a claim about it. That's a poem I teach all the time. Like I teach modern poetry all the time. And if I put that poem on the board and tell students, one of these words is not like the others, which one would you point to with that sort of preface? 9 out of 10 times they will say glazed, like immediately. It's like not a hard thing on some level to notice that it sticks out. If you ask them why they noticed it, they will have all kinds of different claims about it, including like, and they won't necessarily be able to say it this way, but it's one of the two Latinate words in a poem that's full of Anglo-Saxon Germanic derived words, right? So like that's something that they kind of know, but like don't know that they know. And a lot of what I feel like I do as a teacher, I was talking about this with a colleague yesterday, is I describe myself as a professional closet organizer. Like they have a lot of stuff in there. Students come to the class with like a lot of stuff. And part of what I'm trying to do is be like, what if we put some shelves here and labeled them? Like, what if we hung these things there? And so I think it's both very useful to read Jameson and Derrida and be able to bring those kinds of lenses to help students notice, to be aware of your own noticing. And then also like but that doesn't inhibit even first year students from doing this work. They are already coming to literature with a lot of lenses just from like being alive in the world.
Mm-hmm. And the force, I think, of asking them to notice something very specific and to make a claim at that local level is that it slows them down from doing the thing that I always wanted to do, and which I find most of our students always want to do, which is first say they're noticing something that's kind of vague, like a feeling or an aura or a vibe, and then immediately move to stakes at the regional or even global level. Like you just want to kind of immediately be like, this poem is about life, and this is why it's about life, without actually slowly and carefully lingering with the weirdness and moving from like claims at a step-by-step level. So there's a kind of tendency that we're trying by naming these steps to resist and slow down.
Yeah, and I think that's interesting. And I think that depending on what kind of class I'm teaching, right? Like that often shapes that moment too, right? Like if it's an American lit class and I give them the red wheelbarrow and I say, what do you notice? They notice red and white, right? Like as though America is the context of that poem, not just like the language of the
Mm-hmm.
poem. Do you know what I mean? Like, so I feel like even when I put a text on a reading list, like I'm already shaping some of the close reading before it's even started. And I'm really like interested in that moment of just being like, here's the text on its own. Like, what do you do with it?
What happens if you ask them what they're confused by or puzzled by?
Mm. That's good. And again, I think it maybe is your point about risking, right? It's about risking saying, I don't know, or like, I don't get it, or I don't like it, or something. And I'm like, that's fine. That's good.
Or even because I'm just sort of thinking about like if they're noticing red and white and sort of making the context America, they might notice that there's no blue,
Yeah, quite.
right? And then what does that mean
Yeah.
about the fact that this poem is shaping kinds of expectations, perhaps even around, symbols of patriotism?
Yeah, exactly. Like, I mean, yeah, I think I did a class once and we spent probably like an hour and a half on that one poem. They were like, when they came out
Yeah,
at the
I
end, they
love
said,
doing that.
I didn't know we could spend so long on like 6 lines or whatever it is. And I was like, that's the happiest thing for me, right? That we can just
Totally.
linger. But this is really helpful to think this through. I wanted to ask a kind of bigger question about like the bit at the end of your title is for the 21st century, right? Close reading for the 21st century. And part of the contemporaneity you address in the intro is about the kind of the move of theory in the kind of 21st century in particular. But I wonder whether are there other meanings of for the 21st century in your minds when you put this book together? Are there other kind of contemporary contexts or kind of vibes, to use that word, that are kind of lingering as like, why bring this book out now?
Yeah, I would say one was already there for us when we started, and one actually has emerged in the process. So there was already there this sense that we are embedded, to use the largest conceptual term for our moment, neoliberalism, in a moment that is attempting to make school always instrumental. And that this constant attempt that is really intensified since 2008 and isn't stopping makes students want to think about return on investment in the classroom, and makes them want to think about, like, everything I'm doing here ought to lead to some financial career in the future, rather than thinking about the fact that education can address other than economic pursuits, right? Can address aesthetic pursuits, can address pursuits that are about making oneself an agent of knowledge for the sake of knowledge being worth pursuing. And so, wanting to be able to defend that, wanting to be able to make a case that we're doing that in the field of literary studies, that this is at the core of what we're about. And not just that, but making that exciting and desirable for a 19-year-old in 2026, that is really important to us. And that actually, unbeknownst to us, that made this book, I think, really well suited for the emerging hegemony of AI. Because so much of what, and this is the second thing I was referring to that we weren't anticipating, AI attempts to make us passive in with regards to knowledge, and it makes our students passive with regards to knowledge, and it accelerates and intensifies the neoliberal urge to instrumentalize everything, to dumb down literary texts, to summarize, to rewrite them, to make them easier, rather than acknowledging the difficulty as valuable for the aesthetics of it in and of itself. And so when we've got AI just sort of sitting here tempting our students, tempting all of us, trying to make the case for our students, not punitively, not like you can't use AI, not because we're cops, but because we're offering you something better, because we're trying to make the case for you that the work we're asking you to do is worth doing for its own sake. And so the way we wrote this book, Close Reading for the 21st Century, is trying to say this is a practice that is worth it for you to do, and we want to convince you of that in the 21st century.
Yeah, I'll just add that when we started this book, close reading did not feel fashionable. It's now kind of having a moment with other books on close reading coming out, but that obviously was not something we knew about 4 years ago when we first came up with this idea, which, like, still in academic terms is like light speed for a book to come out in the world. But even so, so much changed during that time. And then the other thing I guess I'll just say is that, and I think you can tell this from the way that Dan just answered this question. Like, he and I are both believers, like we believe in literary studies, we believe in this work. And I think, the book has been a joy to work on with Dan and with our contributors, because it has really been a space for this like affirmative belief and community too. Yeah, that comes from it.
I have so many things I want to ask you and talk about, but the generative AI point, right, which I feel like I'm living in a parallel universe in my university. I don't know how your universities are, but I'm like a probabilistic language generator, right? Like a machine is guessing the next possible word in a sequence that it is deriving from all of the garbage of the internet, right? Like, how is that ever useful for anyone, right? Let alone what we do in this kind of cultural world. And I kind of gave my students this is the one and only time I've used ChatGPT, listeners. I asked them to do a close reading of Lydia Davis's short story In a House Besieged. I don't know if you know it. And it did the thing. And then I gave them one that I did like in 10 minutes, right? Just a quick, rough one that wasn't very good. And they were like, we love the ChatGPT one. And I was like, why? And I asked them to like give me the reasons. I didn't tell them it was that at that point. And I was like, do you not see any problems with the reading? They're like, what do you mean? And I was like, look at the quotes. And it had made up all of the quotes. The short story is only like 4 sentences long, but none of the quotes were accurate, right? Like nothing from the story was in it. And I was like, this is the looking closely thing, right? This is the noticing. This is the paying attention to like the words in front of you, not the idea of the story, right? Or the idea of like this machine. So I'm really interested in what you're talking about, making the case for like a better way of approaching. Like I kind of like this more positive spin. I need to think about this and take that forward, because you're right. We can't always just say no. We have to give a reason for why the alternative, which is sitting, thinking. And that's part of the other question I wanted to ask about the format of the book, right? For those who haven't read it yet, you've basically got a range of like writers, scholars who are unpacking and analyzing a close reading of someone else, right? So we're almost doing a close reading of a close reading of then this third thing. And I wonder, at what point did that format come to you, or how did you decide on that? And what do you think it offers?
I'll just start by saying, because I'm assuming that listeners won't see the book, it's a very unusual structure to the book. It is not really like Dan and I kind of invented this, we feel like, as a potential genre, although it's the only one like it so far. But Dan and I co-wrote a 40-page introduction, which is quite long, like almost one of those, very short introductions to X, almost that long.
Yeah.
And then there are 21 essays, each of which is under 3,000 words. This one is under 3,000 words. And then there's another 40 pages of practical pedagogical materials that Dan and I co-wrote. So most edited collections have like a very brief preface and then long scholarly articles from like 8 to 12 people. This one is not that. It's really, we tried to do a sort of course in a book. So the close readings of close readings that, Chris, you mentioned, those are the contributors' essays. The introduction is where we lay out the 5 steps and talk about what close reading is, what it does, and where it comes from in the history of literary criticism. The contributors' essays, we ask people to choose a close reading that mattered to them and explain how it works to an undergraduate audience. And the hope is that these will be really useful for students and teachers alike. So, for example, in a class I taught a year ago, I had students read Keats and then Helen Vendler on Keats, and then Jeff Dolvin and Joshua Coton on Helen Vendler on Keats. And I had them read Sense and Sensibility, and then I had them read D.A. Miller on Sense and Sensibility, and then I had them read Stephanie Inslee Hirschenau on D.A. Miller on Sense and Sensibility, so showing how the magic was done. When did this idea come to us, Dan? It was pretty early on in the process.
Yeah, it was. I remember having in my mind one of the more exciting magazine issues about criticism that I remember, which was from 2014, 2015. It was an issue of the Los Angeles Review of Books called No Crisis. And it did this thing where a scholar, I think it was mostly scholars who were more junior, picked some scholar. I think in that case, they picked mostly living scholars, but who are more senior, and wrote about why they admire them. And it was so wonderful. I just devoured it. It was so wonderful to see the kind of intimacy of that choice and to see people writing about scholarship in this personal way that was also deeply rigorous. And so that was in my mind when we had this thought to have people do something somewhat similar here, but here really tailored to the pedagogical situation. The 21 essays are divided into 5 sections on each of the 5 steps, so that when Josh Coaten and Jeff Dolvin write about Helen Vendler, they're showing for a 20-year-old, here's one thing that Helen Vendler does about how Helen Vendler notices that you can use to learn how to notice. Or when Omari Weeks writes about Hortense Spillers on Gwendolyn Brooks, Omari Weeks says, here's how Hortense Spillers is making a local claim. And here's how you as a 19-year-old can learn something from how Hortense Spillers does and do something like Hortense Spillers, right? So there's that pedagogical element, but there's also this sort of like excitement about reading a critic on a critic that has been important to them and do it in a really writerly way. I mean, these essays stand on their own as really joyful to read. And the other thing I'd say about this is that it enacts, here's the other thing, and I'm going to say two. It enacts a conversation, which is one of the key words for this entire volume is conversation. The idea that any close reading emerges from and enters back into conversation. And so we're kind of modeling conversation between critics in these essays. And then I just taught this book as part of a graduate student course on methods, on the method of close reading. And it serves as something of a overview of literary criticism, which doesn't tend to be taught at the graduate level. We get a lot of theory courses. We don't get a lot of criticism courses. And so the students got this overview of a number of critics. It's a sort of little canon of criticism from a range of fields that gave them a kind of history of literary criticism by actually seeing it done that makes it a lot more robust as a course, has a history of criticism in a course than, say, being like, here's new historicism, here's deconstruction. The individual criticism is actually a lot more interesting and weirder than the kind of ChatGPT version of the overview of these fields. So a lot of work that's happening in these essays.
No, yeah, they're doing,
and they're fun.
They're so fun. I mean, I need listeners to hear this, right? Like, it is an enjoyable book. Like, I've been dipping in and out, like just following my interest from like chapter to chapter. I didn't go, like, I read your intro and then I've been jumping around like based on, the kind of books they're reading, or so many scholars in here that I'm like, oh, it's Natalia. I know Natalia. Oh, it's Omari. Like all of these wonderful people that like I know and love and respect their brains. So it's like really been lovely to kind of follow those paths. And before I'm going to turn to talk about your writing practice in a minute, but I wondered whether there were any little highlights that you wanted to flag up. Like, I love Brian Glavy's chapter on Lauren Ballant reading John Ashbery, not only for the like way Ballant was maybe like misquoting this poem or not realizing the poem went on, but then Glavy uses that to kind of show how their reading of the poem was like spot on anyway. And like it's just like a brilliant conclusion. There's a quote, I have to read it out because I love it so much. Even when we have a strong global theory about our lives, understanding on some level how our lives are shaped by capitalism or racism or history, say, we still have to do the regional work of figuring out what is going on and how to feel about it. I was like, wait, I was not expecting an essay on close reading to like speak to my core. But, that thing you were saying earlier, Dan, about like, we're quite used to making global theories, right? Like this is X, right? Like this is the thing that's defining, but like the regional work, of how does this thing connect to that thing in this small little moment? And how do I feel about it? How do I make sense of it? It's such like a beautiful reading in of itself. Like that's its own global theorizing as it's talking about staying away from global theorizing. I don't know. It was just a moment that really stuck out to me. I wonder whether you had favorite bits or bits that you turn back to.
I have so many. I mean, one thing I'll say is that Dan and I invited scholars and writers that we really admire. We focused on more junior scholars so that this book would really represent the people who were, in the first or maybe middles of their careers, but relatively early stage academics. And then also we edited them, like really, like Dan and I have both written for the public. And these essays are not a sort of like revise, resubmit situation. These essays are themselves the products of many conversations with these writers. So I feel sort of like very connected to all of them, actually. I don't know that I can choose.
Yeah, I'll just offer, I could offer something from any of these, but I'll offer a moment from Summer Kim Lee. she writes about Barbara Johnson, the great deconstructive critic, who I've now taught this book twice, and both times my students have utterly fallen in love with Barbara Johnson. At the end of the semester, I think Barbara Johnson is the critic they've kind of left most desiring to go read more of. And Summer does a brilliant job of helping students navigate Johnson's brilliant and challenging essay about Jane Campion's film The Piano, and about John Keats, and about the history of poetry. It's really ambitious. And Summer's helping our readers see how Barbara Johnson notices. It's in the noticing section. And one thing Summer points out is that the way Barbara Johnson notices begins to show us that there's a kind of noticing in close reading that has certain affinities with the noticing that happens for those who are feminized in our contemporary society. The way that you have to be, if you're disciplined into being a girl or a woman, you're on notice. You're kind of always paying a certain kind of extra attention, maybe at times a paranoid attention to what's going on around you, that can sometimes be like the kind of attention certain subjects bring to close readings. And my students have found that observation to be really powerful. Like you said, Chris, you didn't expect a book about close reading to also kind of teach you about life, or like the center of how we live. But I think that moment where Summer points that out, that being a feminized subject in the world is like the practice of noticing close reading, something where they were like, holy shit, wow, this is more powerful, more than what I thought I was bargaining for when I came here.
Yeah. And a real...
Chris, I have a question for you,
Yeah.
actually.
Yeah.
So one of the things that has been really fun in the wake of this book finding its way to more people is that people have asked us, like, how did you assign these topics? And we said we didn't. We invited the contributors and tried to have a range of theoretical lenses and historical fields of expertise and teaching experience at different kinds of colleges and universities, and like genres and methodology, all these different kinds of things, because our gambit is that close reading is foundational for us all. But then we let the contributors choose who they wanted. And what has emerged is a sort of like cocktail party question of who would you have chosen? That people are now coming up to us and saying, like, why didn't anyone choose X or whoever? Because actually everyone does have their pantheon, or one of the things that was really thrilling about inviting people to contribute was we got emails back like 10 minutes after we sent them saying, like, yes, and I assume that someone already has said this particular close reading, but like that's the one I want. And it's like almost never had anyone said, I mean, like, everyone said really different things in terms of who they wanted. No one did the one I would have chosen, for example. So
Okay, I'll tell you mine, and then you can tell me what you
yes.
would have chosen. Okay, like immediately I have like one answer, and this is the critic. So my like early work and my PhD was on literatures of the US South, and I found Patricia Yeager's book called Dirt and Desire. I don't know if you know it. Reconstructing Southern Women's Writing. I can't remember the full title. But she was, sadly passed away, the most exuberant reader and writer. Like her sentences, like she cares about sentences, which makes me happy, right? It was one of the first academic books that I read that I was like, wait, what's happening here? Why are you talking in this register? How are you drifting? And what she does, she just pulls together so many readings into one, right? She is jumping from Flannery O'Connor to Faulkner and back again without even like a hesitation, like no breath. And there are some gorgeous readings in there of Flannery O'Connor who, all of the problems with her admitted, like she's so good on the textures of, as in the title, Dirt and Desire, like the soil, the way dirt shows up, the way bodies disappear in Southern fiction into the ground, into lakes, into bodies of water. And she does it in a way that is also rich with her own language, right? And full of her own imagery and figurations. And that book sustained me through my PhD. I was like, oh, this is how literary criticism can be done, right? Like that book, it was just like a joy to me. So yeah, that would be my first choice. I have like loads of others, but like I think I would have gone there.
Isn't it interesting that you knew right away, though?
Yeah.
I think like that was our experience talking to contributors too. I kept saying, why is no one choosing Sharon Cameron's 1979 masterpiece Lyric Time? But like that was me,
Yeah. But I think that's it. It's partly showing kind of our affinities and kind of the ways how we've come to text and how we've come to other critics on text, right? And the way that's shaped us. So I think that's the idiosyncrasy that I find really exciting.
And
And
that we knew we were not going to be able to get everyone. And
yeah,
so that was what was actually important, was trying to capture what you're talking about in terms of like this moment of clarity and inspiration.
yeah. I want to kind of swerve, which is what I ask all of the writers on this podcast about your writing practice. I want to know how you two, both very prolific writers and writers in different modes, I think not just within the academy but outside, like how do you write? Do you have writing practices? Are you in the same place? Are you typing? Do you have coffee and chocolate? And how do you do it?
Right. This great question of when people co-write, how exactly are they co-writing? And we're co-writing again right now. I was writing something this morning leading up to this podcast that is part of a co-written document that we've got forthcoming together. We ourselves, we don't do the thing which I've only heard of one other set of co-authors. One set of co-authors is the only set I've ever heard of actually doing this successfully, which is simultaneously writing in a Google Doc, which does seem kind of like insane. Johanna and I do not have that kind of like mind meld.
No,
I mean,
we have a relay race. We have a relay race, I feel like.
yeah, and we talk a lot about we have like a series of Zoom meetings where we kind of brainstorm and talk through and outline and get on the same
And
page about
argue and yeah, and compliment each other, and yes.
all of that. And that's kind of like our pre-writing work. And then we work in Google Doc typically, and we'll kind of like say, okay, you're gonna kind of take the lead on this section, I'll take the lead on that section, and we hand those off and so I'll write some things, Johanna will write some things, and then it's kind of free game, and neither of us, I think importantly to our process, are precious. We're both kind of like, the other person has 100% freedom to do whatever with the words that they think is best. And so there's some instances where I could probably disentangle it, and there's others where I definitely couldn't, from like the introduction of the book of like who wrote
Yeah, I was
that.
thinking about this too.
And like there are ideas in the book where like I no longer can like say, like some of them I can probably, but some it's just like completely lost on me, like whose words or whose ideas those are. They're
Yeah,
shared.
same.
They're really cognitively like shared.
Yes, I totally agree with that. There's like one or two sentences where I'm like, oh, I think I remember writing that, and then I'm like, that could be a false memory though, like because it went back and forth so many times. Maybe I remember revising that. Maybe that's what I'm thinking of, because Dan and I really did each took the job of, drafting something provisionally as provisional because we knew the other one would improve it so much, which is really liberating actually, to be able to write something that someone else will help you with. And help you figure out. And so that's been like really one of the great things for me about writing this book. This book happens simultaneously with my other book, which is coming out in a few months. And the processes were very different, but also like very like this book was so helpful for me because it reminded me how much fun this is, why we do this in the first place.
That's so nice. Yeah, we all need another writer to just make our sentences better. Like that would be great. I need one
Yeah,
of those.
co-writing is great.
And are you like morning writers, nighttime writers? Anytime you can fit it in around your teaching? Do you have to be in a quiet space?
So I'm reading this lovely book right now by Morten Jensen about Thomas Mann, and Thomas Mann, how he wrote The Magic Mountain. And Thomas Mann was like this, kind of anti-bohemian, super buttoned up, kind of really neurotic and organized. And I feel so much identification. It's like, I have a fantasy in my head of myself, like, oh, it'd be lovely if I were such a bohemian, but the truth of my personality and disposition is such that I am profoundly routine oriented and a deeply morning person, and I like must get up at 5:30 in the morning and set my pot of coffee on, and I always like sit down in the same little corner of my couch where I'm sitting right now, where I cannot be like displaced from. And I open up my computer and I start writing, and I have a few hours of good writing, until the sun comes up and my toddler wakes up, and like that's like it just, and even when it wasn't in this house, in this couch, like since I was 19 and started having a writing routine, it's always been wherever I am. I was an undergraduate who was like getting up at 5:30 in the morning, and my friends, were constantly making fun of me for being such a neurotic nerd. And like I would like go to bed at 9:30 as in college, and my friends thought I was nuts. But like it's always been that way for me. Like I have to get up and write first thing at the same spot with the same routine every day.
Okay, I think I am shaped by the fact that I had young children during the pandemic while I was writing two books, and I now fit writing in where I can. And that for like, I don't know, close to a year there, that was 2 hours on a Saturday morning when my husband took our children to the playground, or when we would put the kids to sleep at like 7:30 at night so that we could each have like another blessed 90 minutes. So that has made me, I think, less precious, which is overall good for me. And then also co-writing with Dan is very helpful because I will, especially now that I'm on the West Coast of the United States, but even when we were in the same time zone, wake up to a bunch of stuff from him. That has been in my inbox already for hours. And that's like, like very useful because he sets a good pace. Like this is how I feel when I go running too, is that if I'm running someplace where there are other runners, I try to like be like, who is going about the speed that I want to go? How can I just try to keep up with them? And so like, working with Dan has been really great for many reasons, but one of them is that like he sets the pace and I try to keep up.
We'll keep moving. I keep moving. We keep moving
and
together.
we
Yeah.
and we continue to work together. So like, it's been great.
This is going to be a good sign. Okay, everyone find your pace setter and use that as your writing and find your corner of the room to write in. Okay, final question. What books are you going to recommend to listeners? They could be anything, new, old, stuff you return to.
Okay, I read it. Yes, I was thinking about this. So my book club is now reading The Leopard by Lampedusa. The Leopard. Woo! Like I am just keeping myself from getting on a plane to Palermo, like minute by minute. And then I just finished on the third on the calculation of volume, which you have to start with the first one. But on the calculation of volume is a perspective. I mean, it's not all the way out yet. The third one was just published, but going to be 7 volumes, but they are very short. They're not Proustian. And they all take place on November 18th. And although it's not very Joycean either, and all taking place on one day. But the third volume just came out on November 18th.
Wow.
And so I insisted on buying it that day because it was, calculation of volume day to all who celebrate.
All right, I'll give 3 books. The first is Lisa Robertson's The Baudelaire Fractal, which
Yeah.
She's a poet who's been working in various genres for a long time, but just had her debut novel a few years ago, and this is that. And it's a novel about a writer who imagines or has the experience of having written Baudelaire's complete works. And it's a really poetic, it's a poet's novel, and it's wonderful. The second one is Mark Haber's Lesser Ruins. He's an American writer who's writing in the kind of Thomas Bernhard mode, the rant novel, and it's deeply darkly funny, and it's also sort of in the dark comic tradition I think of Nathaniel West, who's one of my favorite writers of all time. So this kind of like finding humor in the dark heart of modern life. It's really about a community college professor who's been trying for decades to write his book about Montaigne, and is also deeply in a relationship with his son, who is obsessed with electronic music. And about a third of the novel is just his son talking about his obsession with electronic music. It's amazing. And the third one, my favorite book I've read in the last decade probably, is Mircea Cartarescu's Solenoid, which is, he's a Romanian writer. This is one of these big, complex European late modernist books that is kind of about the surrealism of the Romanian 1980s under dictatorship. And it is, again, it's deeply funny, absolutely strange, it's dreamlike, it's absolutely brilliant, about another protagonist who is a kind of depressed teacher. So I don't know what it is about me being really into these books about these sort of abject teachers and professors who are also failed, right? The Solenoid's protagonist is also a failed writer. So something's going on with me, and these figures I find myself attached to. But those are the 3 books I would recommend.
Amazing. Thank you for all these recommendations. I will link them. They're fantastic. Dan, Johanna, thank you so much for your time. This has been thrilling and enjoyable. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chris.
It's been a pleasure. Yeah.
Thank you for listening to this episode. Please subscribe if you haven't already. Leave a review on Apple Podcasts or on YouTube, and share with people on socials. Follow the show and me on Instagram at BooksUpClose. Tag me in any posts of the episodes that you like. And if you can, please do fill out the feedback form that is linked in the show notes. I'll send you some Books Up Close merch if you do, and then send me a message. You can also get show transcripts and more information by subscribing to the Substack. This show is made possible by an Impact Accelerator Award from the University of Hertfordshire and the Arts and Humanities Research Council.